Today we're mainly going to be talking about two different things: a move towards abstraction and absurdism in Europe, starting largely with sculpture, and then we're going to talk about the emergence of modernism in America. We've been very focused on modernism in Europe, but things start to diverge at the beginning of the 20th century as America starts to develop a unique and separate artistic culture that is independent of European modernism. During the last lecture, I talked a lot about Cubism and its importance for a bunch of the styles that emerged during the 20th century, like the art of the Die Brücke group, Orphism, and Futurism. We're going to talk about the next major movements that broke away from the influence of Cubism. Though the art that came after this period was rooted in different ideology than Cubism, we can still see the visual roots of the movement. We're going to pick up where we left off, but with sculpture instead of painting. Though painting had been the reigning medium for a long time in the art world, sculpture had been close behind. In the early 20th century, sculpture underwent a similar profound change in style as painting. It took bounds and leaps towards abstraction, and like the increasingly abstract work of painters, sculptors rejected what they saw as the superficial realism of Academy painting. It tried too hard to represent real life, when it was, in fact, artificial, only a reflection of real life. Like the Cubists and many of the movements inspired by Cubism, these sculptors were also very interested in the stylized forms of human bodies in African sculpture, and this aesthetic is clearly visible in some of their work. This sculpture was created by Umberto Boccioni, a futurist artist. He portrays a man taking powerful strides into space, extensions of his muscles flowing behind him, almost like wings. Even in depicting the human form, futurists were obsessed with progress, technological innovation, and power. This human body has been abstracted to showcase all of these ideas. This sculpture was completed by a Russian sculptor, Naum Gaba. We can clearly see the influence of Cubism in the abstracted construction of the face in disparate geometric shapes. Remember that in Russia at this time we're seeing the development of Cubo-Futurism in painting. So Cubist art and its particular form of abstraction had a lot of influence on not only the painting, but sculpture coming out of Russia. In a painting, these different shapes would be indicated with different colors, or perhaps textures, like the collaging effects of synthetic cubism. Here, however, the artist has cleverly placed protruding pieces of steel at different angles to cast shadows on some parts of the face and body, creating almost an optical illusion. Brancusi, a Romanian sculptor, was also greatly inspired by Cubism and the primitivist themes of Picasso's art. He admired the ability of much of non-Western art to capture the essence of things in a simplistic, abstracted form. In this sculpture entitled The Newborn, Brancusi has created an incredible, smooth shape that somehow, all at once, evokes images of an egg, a baby, and a human head with an open, crying mouth. In conflating all of these images in one smooth, very minimal abstract piece, Brancusi is trying to portray the essence of humanity. So in this case, an egg, a baby. He is saying that birth, the moment that we come into the world, that is the essence of humanity. In this second sculpture by him, we can see the very obvious influence of African sculpture. The stylized treatment of the human form in this reliquary figure, from the Kora peoples of Gabon, suddenly makes the blocky, abstract figure of Brancusi come into focus as a human body. So many artists at this time that are moving towards really quite unrecognizable abstraction are really learning from tribal art all over the world, non-Western, non-industrialized societies. At the same time that these cultures are being looked down upon by Europeans and Americans for being uncivilized, they are the visual inspiration for so much of modern art. At the same time, we see the influence of different styles emerging from Europe. Brancusi was a futurist, and we get a sense of those ideals in this sculpture. He's changed the human form into something industrialized, mechanized. The big blocks of wood, stone, and metal make it feel more machine than human. Dada is a movement that very much grew out of abstraction in sculpture in the early 20th century, but primarily came about in response to the horrors and death of the First World War. Artists that were particularly concerned with the morality of such a huge war and with the thoughtless violence that wiped out hundreds of thousands across Europe started the movement. The Dada movement mocked ideas of rational thought that had been celebrated for so long, pointing out the hypocrisy of modern society's morals when so many were dying senseless deaths for what seemed like no reason. Dada art is built entirely on absurdity. The name itself is meaningless, a nonsense word that was made up to mock even the idea of formal language. Dada artists, most importantly, were the first modern movement to really question what makes something art. They produced a lot of collages, combining images from newspapers, magazines, and books to make cluttered, chaotic compositions that were parodies of more formal art. They also created ready-mades, sculptures created from different found objects. If you've been to a museum with any modern or contemporary art today, these things might not seem so strange, but at the time, people were enraged by the art of the Dadaists. These artists, however, argued that so many of the great paintings at the time were made by workshops of assistants, not the artist him or herself. And art had already changed so much from the formal conventions of the Academy, so who was to say exactly what counted as art and what didn't? This is the main point that Dada artists were trying to reach. In many ways, the Dadaists aimed to offend and prickle, and hoped to force people to question not only what they had been told was art, but also to question the morality of their governments and societies for throwing them into such a violent era of war. They were a very important inspiration for the conceptual art of the late 20th century, as well as performance art. One particularly infamous example of ready-made Dada art, or sculptures created from pre-made materials with very little manipulation on the part of the artist, is Marcel Duchamp's fountain. Duchamp took a urinal, turned it on its side, and painted the name R. Mutt on it. He was part of the Society of Independent American Artists and created Fountain for its annual show, which advertised itself as unjuried, so any work would be accepted with the admission fee. Duchamp anonymously submitted the work with the fee, and it was rejected. Pointing out the hypocrisy of the committee, he then resigned. Duchamp, in classic Dada fashion, is questioning what constitutes art and why. Post-Impressionists, Expressionists, and early abstract artists had already defied the old rules of art, that it had to be beautiful or look finished, or even be an original concept, since so much of the work at this time built off art of the past. So Duchamp, while mocking the formality of art shows with a piece that is basically a bathroom joke, also pushes the boundary of what we consider art and why. A journalist defending Duchamp's work said this of Fountain: "The only works of art America has given are her plumbing and bridges," and added, "Whether Mr. Mutt with his own hands made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, created a new thought for that object." Ready-mades asserted the principle that what is art is defined by the artist. There are 3 important points. First, the choice of the object itself is a creative act. Second, canceling the useful function of an object transforms it into art. And third, the way the object is presented, including a new title, give it a new thought. This is in many ways the basis for conceptual art, which would come later on. All of this was a reaction to the rigidity of the art world. In this ready-made, Duchamp has taken a cheap reproduction of the Mona Lisa on a postcard and scrawled over it. The letters on the bottom are a dirty joke when read aloud in French. Duchamp, like the other Dadaists, is mocking what is seen as the moral and visual standard for art, and pushing the boundaries of what art has to be. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about what was going on in America at this time. America was a little bit behind the art trends of Europe, so while abstract and conceptual heavy movements flourished in Europe, the avant-garde wasn't as popular in America. Most artists in the States were more interested in naturalism until about 1915, when we see the beginnings of modernist trends. One artist who is particularly emblematic of early 20th century modernist painting is Georgia O'Keeffe. Although she is primarily known for her detailed macroscopic paintings of flowers, O'Keeffe painted in a variety of styles with different subject matter over the course of her career. In the 1920s, she began to paint skyscrapers of the distinct New York City skyline. Unlike the Futurists and other modernists who celebrated industrialization, O'Keeffe paints the buildings in a menacing manner. The stark forms and the low vantage point make the dark buildings loom over the viewer threateningly, blocking out the sky. O'Keeffe and other American modernists often included themes of city life, and often in a menacing or dangerous light. It's not much of a surprise that O'Keeffe turned to almost exclusively scenes of nature in her later paintings. Her paintings were more abstract and expressive at first, but with her flower series, O'Keeffe found a clever way to achieve abstraction through naturalism, by zooming in onto flowers until they became abstractions. With the advent of more advanced photography, macro images became more accessible. In O'Keeffe's flower paintings, she creates massive versions of the smallest inner folds of flowers, giving the viewer access to a whole new world of delicate shapes and lines that look almost abstract before you realize what you're looking at. Many critics noted that the close-up images of flower petals resembled female genitalia, and that is still an observation that many make today. The inner structure of a flower, a reproductive system in and of itself, does bear some resemblance to a vulva. However, O'Keeffe firmly denied that this was the point or the focus of her work, and that the largely male audience of critics and dealers were imposing what they wanted to see in a work that was not made exclusively for the male gaze. In her later works, traveling and living in the American Southwest, O'Keeffe created dreamy desert landscapes, Cezanne-like in their angular intensity, but with the often almost surreal overlaying of animal skulls and bones. Like many other American modernists, O'Keeffe was inspired not just by the modernist movements of Europe, but by the unique and varied landscape and cityscape of the United States. Like European modernists that moved towards abstraction, American modernists were also interested in capturing the essence of things, abstraction but still somewhat representational. This portrait of a German officer captures artist Marsden Hartley's fascination with the pageantry of the German military during World War I. Though there is no person immediately evident in the portrait, we more get a sense of what fascinated the artist: the crisp uniform, the patches and pins and medals on it, the shining weaponry, the flags and parades, and obsession with rank and uniform. We get just the essence of a fully uniformed and decorated German officer. American artist Charles Demuth quickly rose in popularity for employing a similar ideology in his painting. He aimed to capture the essence of things as well, but unlike O'Keeffe, the height of his work consisted largely of industrialized and man-made subjects. In Sail in Two Movements, clearly inspired by the Cubist aesthetic, the jagged, crisscrossing lines cut up the image into fragments, suggestive of violent movement. Only when we unfocus from these sections can we see that it is a sailboat. Despite its clear straying from naturalism, we still get a sense of the scene. Turbulent waves and gusts of wind whipping the boat up and down and snapping the sails. This is one of his most famous works, I Saw the Figure 5 in Gold, one of a series of paintings based on the work of other American writers and artists. This was based on a poem of the same name by William Carlos Williams. Among the rain and lights, I saw the figure 5 in gold, on a red fire truck, moving, tense, unheeded, to gong clangs, siren howls, and wheels rumbling through the dark city. Using the poem as inspiration, Demuth has captured the essence of an experience we are all now very familiar with in the 21st century: a fire truck roaring down the street, all speed and bright light and color and loud sounds. There is no actual image of a fire truck here, but rather the essence of the experience of a fire truck with its lights and sirens on. Demuth cleverly echoes the shape of the massive 5 in the front as it recedes to the back, also giving the illusion of movement as the truck speeds toward us. Here, just like with O'Keeffe, there is a menacing, dangerous feeling given to modern industrial society. Modernism in America wasn't limited to painting and sculpture either. The decades following the formation of the Chicago School, which we talked about a few lectures ago as the first big architectural group in America, saw an explosion in new and innovative architecture inspired by principles of the modern aesthetic. One of the most important and influential architects from this time was Frank Lloyd Wright. Also from Chicago, he established the Prairie School of Architecture, which made him famous. These homes, sprawling and flat with low-hanging roofs and dramatically cantilevered overhangs, were a unique and fresh take on architecture, especially for personalized homes. In the interior, we can see the influence of Japanese architecture, which inspired many of Wright's works. He appreciated the balance and organization of space he saw in Japanese architecture, as well as the screen-like windows. He also, unlike many other architects, designed all of the furniture in the interior of the houses he created. One of his most famous projects is the Falling Water House in Pennsylvania. Although Frank Lloyd Wright was building off of the work of other modern architects with their stark, simplistic lines and minimalist aesthetic, he combined this sense of the industrial with an appreciation for nature. This entire building has been built into the landscape as part of it, rather than a separate imposition. The waterfall is natural, and the house has been cleverly constructed so that the water can continue to flow underneath it. Certain beams of the house have even been constructed in a curved fashion to accommodate growing trees rather than cutting them down. Wright believed that buildings should not simply sit on the landscape, but coordinate with it. When asked what could be done to improve city architecture, Wright responded, "Tear it down." We can see in all works by American modernists that the sense of unease and anxiety and even disgust with industrialized society is a strong theme. In Europe, there were more mixed feelings about this, but they came to a head with movements like Dadaism that reacted with disgust to the formality of the art world and the war and profit-mongering of governments in the era of industrialization. Generally, Europe moved towards abstraction more quickly than America. But in America, a unique style of modernism emerged that was deeply inspired by the distinct landscapes and cityscapes of the United States in the early 20th century.